author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Biden family money scandal, Mitt Romney demands the GOP field clears out, and the three branches of government are under threat. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll be discussing all of the aforementioned topics and a whole lot more. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our listeners out on KACT 1360 AM out of Andrews, Texas. Thank you for being here and being part of the team. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Each day brings fresh revelation about alleged influence schemes connected to Hunter and now even Joe Biden. The pressure is on, and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has even mentioned the I word, impeachment, as a way to dig deeper into the allegations. So what does it all mean, and can the current president weather the storm? We're very lucky to have with us Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent and satirist, Mr. Graham J. Noble. Thanks for coming in, Graham.
Pleasure to be here, Mark.
So tell me, as we record on July 26, what's the lie of the land for Joe Biden right now?
Well, it appears more than anything else that he is. I don't know. You know, he's Teflon Joe, right? Isn't he? I mean, he's like the most untouchable president we've ever had. I think it's amazing that this all this evidence is piling up against him, and of course, nothing. You know, no crimes have yet to be proven, but the evidence that crimes have been committed is just right there. It's like the it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and Joe Biden and the Democrats are just acting as if none of this exists, as if the entire thing is just a made-up fable by the Republicans. And so far, they appear to be mostly getting away with that. But that is, of course, because, it's Joe Biden's administration. It's Joe Biden's Justice Department. It's Joe Biden's FBI. It's Joe Biden. I mean, so it's quite incredible.
Actually, what you say there about it's something that's not even acknowledged that there's all this evidence piling up, and we should make clear, obviously, evidence is not proof, but there's all this evidence piling up, and it just seems to slip under the radar. The media is not paying attention to it, and it reminds me I'm a bit of a Lovecraft fan, and there's it's always a study of people going slowly insane while they're trying to operate in the world, and I got to thinking, am I going crazy? Does this evidence not exist? Is it some, what do they call it, eldritch pile of evidence or something that just doesn't exist on this plane where we're waiting for Cthulhu to sweep in and take it all away? But I know that a handful of let's call them the wilder GOP House members, I think we all know who we're talking about there, they've been pushing impeachment of Joe Biden since day one. Now, recently, just this week, we had House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. He also floated the possibility, saying that an impeachment inquiry is the way to dig down through the layers of evidence. But I want to ask you, Graham, politically, does this help or hurt Joe Biden? Or is it both?
I don't see any way in which it helps him, because I think that there's a good contrast here between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The more legal problems that are thrown at Trump, and the more he was impeached twice, but of course acquitted twice in the Senate. But since he left office, he's been just bombarded with these different legal inquiries and these criminal inquiries and these indictments, and each time one of those rears its head, he becomes more popular. And that is, I think, because the majority of Americans, and I think even a lot of Democrat voters, even though they would never admit it out loud, even a lot of Democrat voters believe, I think, that this is pure, in Trump's case, it is pure political persecution. They are just going after him. They are determined to get him. They're determined to stop him, try to stop him running for president. They're determined even to throw him in prison. And that's just helping his case. But in Biden's case, there's not that. And that's because he's just not a popular guy. And, I think most Democrats at this point are thinking to themselves, it's kind of buyer's remorse. How did we end up with this guy? And now we're looking at this guy running for a second term. And so I think the push against Biden, and particularly the push to impeach him, in no way helps him whatsoever. No, I don't necessarily think it hurts him, because let's face it, the House could impeach him because the House is majority Republican. Even though I could see a bunch of Republicans in the House.
Oh yeah, there's at least
not impeaching him.
10.
But either way, he's not going to be. He's not going to be convicted in the Senate and removed from office. We know that. Because the Republicans certainly do not have the votes for that. So, but my view, Mark, is that at this point, I actually think it's the duty, almost you could say it's the moral duty of the Republicans at this point to launch an impeachment investigation, because this scandal is too massive to just ignore it, just brush it off. No, I think it's got to be done.
Yeah, I guess the benefit of an impeachment inquiry, whether that leads to an impeachment vote or not, is that it will force the evidence to be looked at. Subpoenas will be issued. I believe having an impeachment inquiry grants the power of subpoena for that, and then they can actually just look at everything. And obviously, no president wants to undergo this, but if he is entirely innocent, and that is entirely possible that he's entirely innocent. But at least that way they can put it to bed before the election comes around, the 2024 election comes around. But it occurs to me that impeachment has really just become another tool of the House. And I mean, can you imagine a situation in the future where a president doesn't get impeached when they lose control of the House? Because it seems to me that politics has been driven by such a wedge that the new normal is use every weapon at your disposal, and that will be the media attacks or impeachment. Can you see a time coming when, impeachment is the norm?
Well, I think the Democrats made it so, because both times that they impeached Donald Trump, it was over trivial matters. I mean, he got impeached for making a phone call to the president of Ukraine.
Let's please point out. Sorry to interrupt there, Graham, but this is President Volodymyr Zelensky, not Vladimir Zelensky, as Joe Biden likes to call him. But yes. He said that the phone call was fine. There was nothing untoward in it. Now, apparently, they impeached him. Therefore, they did not believe that Volodymyr Zelensky was an honest man, and yet now, billions of dollars to Mr. Zelensky because he's an honest man all of a sudden.
And he's a hero all of a sudden. Yes, it is strange how that happens. But I do think the Democrats kind of normalized impeachment. But I just tend to think that, in the case of Joe Biden, it really is someone who's politically partisan is always going to say, well, it's different with this case. But I mean, it really is, because this is, if ever there was a case for impeachment against any president, it's this one. I mean, this is too big not to ignore. And also, I think, the thing is, if there's an impeachment inquiry, that actually forces this whole issue out into the open, because right now there are a whole bunch of Americans who perhaps only watch CNN and MSNBC and really have no idea what's going on with this alleged bribery and alleged funneling of money from foreign countries, pay to play. There's a lot of Americans, they don't even know this is going on, and so an impeachment inquiry will put that front and center in the on the stage, if you like.
There's a great quote by Walter Lippmann. It says, there can be no liberty for a community which lacks the means by which to detect lies. And I think that applies quite well. Graham J. Noble, thanks ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent and satirist, Mr. Graham J. Noble. Now, earlier in the show, we talked about the Biden family issues. Now I want to hop more to the other side of the aisle. Graham, the GOP primary field, it's really filling up again, a situation that I guess in 2016 gave Trump it gave him a real boost, didn't it? That there were so many, the crowded platform allowed him to almost bob and weave. But now we have Senator Mitt Romney, Willard Mitt Romney of Utah, trying to take away that advantage. What's happening?
Well, I think the first thing to say about that, Mark, is that, Mitt Romney is desperately he's trying to now kind of position himself as kingmaker within the Republican Party. I mean, the man is irrelevant. Quite frankly, I'm amazed that he's still in the Senate at all. But of course, then again, it's an interesting, on a side note, it's interesting that the Congress as a whole has something like a 98% re-election rate, and yet they have a less than 20% approval rating. So
there's something wrong there. There is something wrong with that equation
that we should discuss another day, because there's a lot to delve into there. But anyway, so Mitt Romney, I think he's just trying to remain relevant. Notice he chose not to run for president himself this time. And now, of course, he's basically saying, well, there's too many people in this race. That's going to help Trump. So basically, all the ones who have realistically no chance of winning the nomination should drop out. But I think if everyone's going to take him at his word, then Trump is going to be running uncontested. Because, in my opinion, really, I'm not sure that Vivek Ramaswamy is surging, and I think I like the fact that he's running for the nomination. I like what he has to say, and I think that's a good thing. But Ron DeSantis has always been considered as Trump's number one contender there, and yet Ron DeSantis, he fired 38 members of his campaign just the other day, and he said,
the DeSantis Great Reset.
And he said, of course, is streamlining and making it more effective. But when you fire 38 members, basically about a third of his campaign was given the pink slip, and he's not doing so well. While Trump continues to surge in popularity, DeSantis really isn't going anywhere. And so, but yeah, Romney is desperate. He's another one of these. He's another kind of what is it about Republicans from Utah? I don't know, but and Wyoming and places like that. They seem to be very anti-Trump, and they've got the right to do that. But he is just desperate to try to figure out some way to get one over on Trump and somehow prevent him becoming the nominee. And I'm not sure that really it makes a difference at this point whatsoever.
It's an interesting strategy, isn't it, though? So he thinks that candidates with no serious pathway, which if we look at the polling now, sure, we're a long way out, so polling is, it's a bit off. And, of course, Donald Trump is facing numerous indictments, any of which could land him in jail, which, although that is no preclusion of him actually still running for office and assuming the presidency, even if he is in jail, interestingly enough. But it seems that these candidates with no viable pathway, which, as you point out, could be all of them, they may end up splitting the anti-Trump vote, thereby inadvertently handing a victory to the Donald. But does Mitt Romney not have faith in the electorate, the GOP electorate, to vote tactically to get what they want?
No, I think Mitt Romney is one of these, he's one of these establishment types who, quite frankly, I'm quite certain he despises the electorate, and he thinks that the American voters are just stupid, and they basically have to be, they have to be guided in some way, or even coerced in some way into voting a particular way. I mean, you obviously Mitt Romney's logic, if you like, is kind of sound because if Trump was only facing, say, one or maybe two primary challengers, then that would be a kind of a problem for him because all of the people out there who really do not want Trump to be president again, but vote Republican, are going to vote for one of those two other candidates, and probably that would be damaging. My personal view, and of course I'm not endorsing anyone here, but my personal view of this, just realistically, is it really doesn't matter this time around. It doesn't matter. I think that even if it was just Trump and DeSantis in this primary race, I still think Trump would win it by a mile. And like I said, that's not an endorsement. That's just the way I see it shaking out. I can't imagine at this point anybody beating Trump.
Well, that's not just you. That's pretty much every poll that's come out, including the conservative straw poll things that they do, where it's like 87% would go for Donald Trump. I mean, he really does seem to have the nomination sewn up. But
I would say very quickly, Mark, I would say that a lot of that is I believe, this is my personal theory, this is not so much about Trump's popularity as it is he's been harassed so much now by the establishment and by the media, and because that harassment has now kind of manifested itself in all kinds of indictments and other legal cases. And I also think at this point, Trump's, monstrous lead in the polls is literally about conservatives saying, they're just giving the finger to the establishment. They're saying, oh yeah, you're going to go after Trump this hard. We're going to support him, because, F you, basically, to the establishment. I think it's as much about that as it is about Trump's actual popularity.
I think you're on something there, Gray. I mean, it is something that you have explored on the pages of libertynation.com briefly. But there's this idea that let's say Trump, let's do a what if here. Let's say Trump wasn't involved in any of these things. And let's say that Joe Biden was running against an incumbent Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump's Department of Justice decided to launch indictment after indictment against Joe Biden, who was gaining steam in the polls. I mean, I think that Democrats and even some Republicans, certainly a lot of independents, might get behind Joe Biden just to say to Donald Trump, hey, authoritarian, you can't do this. You can't do this in America. And I think that's exactly what's happening on the other side, on the Republican side. You've got the Republicans, you've got independents. And it just so happens that because it's Donald Trump, very few people are willing to look at that dichotomy of authoritarianism that at least appears to be happening. And I think because of Donald Trump's personality, people are refusing to look at it. Graham, we're about to go over time. I thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us in this fascinating conversation. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
President Joe Biden is under pressure regarding his son's business dealings and new evidence showing that he was intimately involved. And former President Trump facing more legal woes that just seem to increase by the week. Now, is there any way the next general election can run smoothly? To help us wade into these murky depths, we're fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and the host of the superb Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thanks for being here, Scott.
And I'm now tearing it up on Twitter, Mark, or X as well. So please don't forget.
He has three Twitter accounts, formerly known as Twitter accounts. That's XXX Scott D. Cosenza, apparently.
Don't you dare.
Okay, the social media platform formerly known as X. Yes, you can check out the Uprising podcast on there, and it's kind of fantastic. So I do recommend you head over and follow Scott. Now, Scott, let's talk about the legal shenanigans. The novel legal shenanigans that are facing our two most likely presidential candidates for 2024. Now, I do hate to use the term unprecedented Scott. For as the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. But surely this predicament that we're looking at, as in both leading candidates facing legal jeopardy, that's pretty novel, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is certainly novel, Mark. And while I was asking you to plug my now formerly Twitter and now X profile at Podcast Uprising, I don't know that I said thank you for having me once again on the show, so I'll do that now. And we've got really Trump is the one facing the mountain of legal burden, and the reason why, of course, is because it's Biden and his allies that control the levers of who is subject to, who gets the boot put on them is who owns the
it's
heel,
worth repeating again, and again, Scott. And I learned this from you. Every prosecution is a political decision. It's just worth repeating that again and again.
Yeah. The decision to prosecute is political. It's baked into it. Not the decision to prosecute Donald Trump is political. The decision to prosecute the guy down the street caught with the whatever is political, right? What are we valuing? There was a time in our society where we did not value prosecuting people with, drugs on them, right? Before the drug war arose in the 60s and 70s, we just, it was not a priority. So why did it become a priority? Well, because the politics changed. And the same is true now with respect to Donald Trump. The people who have the means of prosecution are more closely allied with Joe Biden and Democrats, and so they're exercising that. And
so if you can, could you give me a quick rundown of this mountain of legal challenges that Donald Trump's facing?
So there are civil cases and criminal cases, and there's a state fraud trial in New York in October on I think that's about some business fraud that has been alleged by New York authorities. Now, this is it's kind of interesting because I think typically we think of civil cases occurring between private parties, but also the government can bring civil cases against defendants. And so it's actually, even though it's in the civil courts, it's a government action against somebody. And that's the case there. Then there's the E. Jean Carroll Part Due trial, which is going to be in January. And then later on in January, there's another trial in New York on a kind of fraud where they said that they improperly induced people to do business with them based on the Trump name. And those are kind of minor issues compared to criminal trials, which there are two scheduled and one that may be upcoming. So there is a New York case, a false business records case, which is the preposterous case we've spoken about before in
Stormy Daniels payment case. Alvin Bragg, DA.
Right. And then there's the federal criminal, the sort of Mar-a-Lago raid case, if people think about it that way, the documents handling case, which has, I think, I'm not even going to speculate when the current trial date is if they moved it, but that's going to be advanced at some point in the future. We don't really know when that will go to trial, but certainly it won't be in a couple weeks here. And then
I believe that the last I heard from that was that it was going to be in May 2024, but there's a lot that could change between now and then.
I wouldn't buy your plane tickets to the federal courthouse in Miami just yet. And then we're speculating, or not we're speculating, but there is a great deal of speculation, and the people who get the leaks seem to be speculating that Mr. Jack Smith, the independent counsel, or special prosecutor, is going to indict Donald Trump on some kind of charge emanating from what happened at the Capitol on January the 6th. Now, those of us who examined Mr. Trump's actions that are publicly available for what he did on January 6th, and then look at the federal law, might say, what possible crime could you charge him with? And, I say this without trying to denigrate Mr. Smith. If you're willing to bend and push and pull and do whatever you can to try to, fit behavior into culpability that the law was not intended to address when it was passed, then the world's your oyster. And I expect that there are a number of provisions that, again, if you're not trying to be strictly adhering to the reason for a criminal law's institution.
Almost certainly a piracy charge coming up there for Donald Trump. Now, this thing with Mr. Smith, this is actually coming on the heels of the impeachment, isn't it? The second impeachment of Donald Trump, because the House recommended that the DOJ follow up on charges based on their findings during the impeachment trial, and this seems to be an extension of that. Now, do we know for sure one way or the other whether it is or not, or is this new possible indictment because Jack Smith found something while he was investigating something else, or don't we know?
I have absolutely no idea.
Very well, let's play a hypothetical game here.
And I think that it's wrong to consider it a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump will be indicted based on January 6th, the events of, because, boy, another kind of staggering trip down ignoring norms and what is the non-political case for indicting Donald Trump? It doesn't seem like there is one, right? Like, we can't have that happen again. What, a president of the United States encouraged? I mean,
Let's get to my hypothetical game here, Scott. Now, Kevin McCarthy recently said that he's pondering, or words to the effect that he's pondering doing an impeachment or launching an impeachment investigation into Joe Biden and the various things that are happening with his family.
He's considering honoring his promise to the
apparently
to the independent-minded Republicans who extracted a promise from him that he would, in fact, institute an impeachment investigation if they voted for him for speaker.
Oh no, I'm fully aware of Mr. McCarthy's motivations, or what apparent motivation. But now let's say that does go ahead, and the impeachment inquiry comes up with a recommendation that is ultimately that the DOJ needs to launch its own investigation into Joe Biden based on the findings of the impeachment inquiry. As was apparently the case with Jack Smith. Now, I just want to have a question for you here. Now, with Trump facing the likely indictment, how will this work? Would Joe Biden direct Joe Biden's DOJ to launch an investigation into Joe Biden?
Well, of course not, I think, is the answer. And also, the impeachment committee or an impeachment bill that directs the DOJ to do anything has as much weight as if you and I right now type up a letter to the DOJ and demand that they do something. The DOJ is an executive body, and it works for the president of the United States to do his bidding within the law, we hope, but has, what a senator or congressman thinks of, they can address when they fund the DOJ, and they can address when they pass laws that DOJ personnel are to follow. But the idea that they can address or direct DOJ investigations, absolutely out of bounds. That is an executive function, has nothing whatsoever to do with the legislature.
And it seems very unlikely that a sitting president would direct his agencies to investigate himself. I think that's almost impossible, isn't it, Scott?
Well, I mean, I just don't see it happening with Mr. Biden. I mean, it's possible, but
with Joe Biden, pretty much anything's possible. Scott D.
my breath.
Thanks ever so much for being here.
Cheers.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back talking liberty with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and fount of all knowledge, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. Earlier in the show, we talked about the legal shenanigans taking place this election cycle. But now I want to drift ever so gently into an interesting liberty-based piece of news that I came across. Now, Scott, there was an open letter from some fairly high-profile law professors who argued that Joe Biden should overturn the, air quotes here, mistaken decisions of the MAGA court. Now, Scott, I just want to read you a short excerpt from that and get your take on this. Mm-hmm. So here it goes. Quote, "We urge President Biden to restrain MAGA justices immediately by announcing that if and when these issue rulings that are based on gravely mistaken interpretations of the Constitution that undermine our most fundamental commitments, the administration will be guided by its own constitutional interpretations." End quote. Scott, a constitutional lawyer, what's your take on that?
It's good to be the king. And
it's good to be king. It is indeed.
This is the work of Harvard law professor Mark Tushnet. and San Francisco State University political scientist Aaron Belkin. And it quite literally, and I don't say this to denigrate the proposal, but to accurately characterize it, it says that if Biden strenuously disagrees with a Supreme Court ruling that he considers to be, I think, fundamental or some other word like that's a cousin to that word, that it's okay for him to just go ahead and ignore, practically speaking, the opposite of ignore, excuse me. They don't actually ask that he ignore it. They say that he announce why the Supreme Court is incorrect and their interpretation of the law is wrong, and that he's going to follow his correct interpretation of the Constitution, and that if the courts don't like it and he won't follow their court orders, that the redress that we have as a republic is at the voting booth. Now, of course, the funny thing that I thought is, if they let in, let's just say hypothetically, let's say there was not President Biden, just some other president, okay, let in millions and millions of illegal immigrants, okay, against the law, and let
such
them
a thing
vote.
could never happen in America. It's clearly hypothetical, right?
The law, and then other people challenged those votes because it produced a result whereby we didn't honor our democracy. Then the result would be, well, he doesn't have to listen to the courts anyway because the votes are in, and so it's a circular kind of. It's a cycle of that recycling 3-arrow kind of thing of, he gets to do whatever he wants just because he can. That is sort of that's the argument. And the kind of thing that just sort of baffles everybody and just kind of has everybody gobsmacked is was a popular argument by segregationists when the liberals in our country led the charge to desegregate America, and got all these court rulings that broke down the barriers of segregation. And the segregationists said, well, Supreme Court wants to go ahead and integrate this school. Let them come down and enforce their order, right? Like the governors would, these Southern governors. And, of course, that's not what we had. That's why Kennedy famously, sent the troops into Little Rock and other places to enact these desegregations, because they were enforcing a court ruling. So you can imagine if that never happened, the Supreme Court relies on the executive to enforce their rulings. So
I got to dig deeper into this, Scott. So presumably, and now I am making a presumption here, but I would say that this professor and political scientist are on the left of the political divide. I mean, it's an assumption. I know I should never do such things, but I find it curious because we've seen in the papers in these recent weeks all sorts of stories about how if Donald Trump wins in 2024, he plans to seize powers from federal agencies and rest them within the executive, and how we should be very afraid of that. And yet these two gentlemen and I'm guessing they must be Democrats based on their language, they want Joe Biden to go even further than that. How does anybody square that circle?
Well, Mark, it's confusing to me because don't you realize that they have the purest of intentions and brother love and worship of the common man, and Donald Trump is bad. And so when Donald Trump has powers that are all encompassing, he uses them for badness, and so that's a poor exercise of power. But when Mark Tushnet and Aaron Belkin convince people to give Joe Biden dictatorial style powers, it's because he's using them in a Christ-like fashion for all our betterment, that it becomes a force for good. And that's why we should do it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's all about the perspective then, is it, Scott? So, let me put this as bluntly
it's madness is the answer.
It's madness.
It reads like madness. And here's all you have to do, I think, to think about it is apply it to the other side. Two kind of out there a bit conservative legal theorists say that President Trump should ignore Supreme Court rulings by, ultra Soros justices. Okay, that would be the mirror image, because they're threatening democracy, and just if and not. I mean, people would be going crazy if that actually was implemented on that side. I think maybe also, there is some critical thinking and rationality left on the left in the Republic to also see that this is a recipe for disaster.
Well, I mean, let's put this as bluntly as we can, what this recipe actually is. As far as I can follow it, if Joe Biden followed or attempted to follow the advice of these Harvard and San Francisco scholars, it would effectively end the three branches of government system, wouldn't it? And yet these university professors, I think, I know the Harvard gentleman is professor. I presume the political science chap is also. They teach at university. They teach law and political science, and yet they're suggesting that we do away with the whole three branches of government.
Well, they don't actually say those words. That's your
But that is the result, isn't it?
Well, one of the things I think it's important to talk about is how we don't have a system whereby what the Supreme Court should do and how it should do it is clearly delineated in our Constitution, like the roles of our president and the executive branch and senators and congresspersons in the legislative branch are clearly delineated. So the Supreme Court, Article 3 of our Constitution it lays out the Supreme Court, and it is very brief and broad compared to the specificity and length that Articles 1 and 2 cover, those other branches. And so it wasn't clear to everyone at the time the Republic was founded, like how the Supreme Court would actually work. It wasn't until 1803 in the case of Marbury versus Madison that the court asserted its power to strike down legislation as unconstitutional. And the other branches went along with it. And if they didn't go along with it, we may have had and would have had an entirely different history and republic, Mark. But the Supreme Court asserted in 1803 that they had the power to do it, and we've gone along with it ever since.
And a final question for you, Scott. We presume that Joe Biden will not implement this particular suggestion, but he is trying to expand the court. That appears to be coming from a hard left position that they can dilute the power of the court to get to the position that they want, which is overturning or getting rid of these big decisions, right?
Well, I think maybe wrong on the first part of your question, which is that Biden wouldn't do it. And here's why. I read a conservative legal commentator that may have been Jonathan Turley. I can't exactly recall now who it was, who said that Mr. Tushnet and Mr. Belkin were actually writing with an audience of one in mind when they published their letter. And that audience was Joe Biden, who, because of his long presence on the Senate Judiciary Committee and being a law school graduate after he was readmitted after his plagiarism scandal, I think, he fashions himself a legal scholar. And also, according to some folks who have examined his positions on it, not terribly, not with great fidelity necessary to the Constitution or mainstream legal thought, when it may benefit him to deviate from it. So,
I have my answer. An audience of one to the detriment of all. Scott DiCosenza, thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
And that's almost all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests today, Graham J. Noble and Scott DiCosenza, and extend my deep appreciation to you, the listeners, for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to leave you with the wise words of George Washington. He said, quote, "A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important? And what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country?" Now, it seems to me that those who seek power are missing the key education that George Washington suggested. Why else would the republic be suffering so badly if not for those in control fundamentally not understanding the processes of said government? Now, surely they wouldn't be making a hash of things because they were either dishonest or incompetent, would they? Well, I'll leave you to think on that yourself. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.